When I find out who this guy is, I'm going to beat the tar out of him. I eventually found out that it was Brock Lesnar. I mean, it was pretty obvious they were driving together and spending a lot of time together. And she looks at me and says, "Mark, I want a divorce." What?
Every wrestling era has a match that defines it. This era had something else, a marriage, playing out in front of millions, that would end up shaping the lives of three people the wrestling world would never stop talking about. It begins in 1996, at a moment when nothing about the future was written yet. Marc Mero arrived in the WWF that year as one of the most sought-after free agents in the business. Having built his name in World Championship, wrestling under the character Johnny B. Bad, he was athletic, charismatic, and genuinely over with crowds. When he signed, the company handed him something it had never given anyone before, a fully guaranteed contract, in an era when wrestlers were typically paid only for the shows they worked. It was a statement of belief. Vince McMahon was betting on Marc Mero. He didn't arrive alone. His wife, Rena, came with him, introduced to audiences under a new name, Sable. She joined as his valet, the performer who accompanies a wrestler to the ring and helps build the audience's connection to the character. At that point, the arrangement was clear. Marc was the headline. Sable was the support system standing just behind him. Few people backstage and fewer fans in the crowd would have guessed just how completely that arrangement was about to be rewritten. For a while, that arrangement held. Marc competed as the Wildman, a high-flying persona built on real, athletic credibility. He'd been an amateur boxing champion in New York before ever stepping into a wrestling ring, which gave him a genuine toughness that audiences responded to. He won the Intercontinental Championship and built himself into one of the more reliable stars on the roster. Sable found her footing at ringside, and audiences responded to her in a way that was hard to define, but easy to notice. Still, she remained firmly in a supporting role. Nobody watching in 1996 could have guessed how quickly that hierarchy was about to reverse itself, or what it would eventually cost the marriage underneath it. The shift began with an injury. In February 1997, Marc tore his ACL, a ligament injury requiring surgery and roughly 8 months of recovery. In wrestling, 8 months off television airs close to a lifetime, long enough for entire storylines to be built and forgotten, long enough for an audience's attention to drift somewhere new entirely. While Marc healed away from the cameras, the company needed someone to fill the space he'd left behind, and Sable stepped into it. What happened next surprised almost everyone, including, by most accounts, Sable herself. Her popularity didn't just hold steady in Marc's absence, it exploded. By the time he returned, she had become one of the most commercially valuable performers in the entire company, with merchandise sales that rivaled the industry's biggest names. Harry Narkuvuntud Nofaisindaige, Playboy cover became one of the best-selling issues in the magazine's history. She had crossed over from wrestling personality into a genuine mainstream celebrity, something almost no one in the company, Marc included, had actually predicted. The company noticed the shift and wrote it directly into the storyline. Marc was repackaged as a jealous, controlling husband character, playing out on-screen tension with his own real-life wife in front of live audiences every week. It's worth sitting with what that actually meant. A real marriage, already adjusting to a dramatic change in status behind the scenes, was now being reenacted as entertainment for paying crowds, and with Marc cast as the villain standing in the way of his wife's success. Whatever tension existed privately between them, the storyline made sure it played out publicly too. By 1999, the pressure had moved beyond the storyline and into the company itself. Sable left WWF and filed a lawsuit alleging harassment and unsafe working conditions, including claims that she had been pushed toward increasingly explicit content and penalized for refusing. The figure attached to the suit was reported in the tens of millions of dollars, depending on the account. WWF disputed the claims, and the lawsuit was ultimately settled out of court, with the full details never made public. What is documented, though, is what Marc chose to do in response. He had 3 years remaining on his guaranteed contract, real financial security in an unpredictable industry. And he walked away from it to stand beside her. That decision is worth pausing on. In an industry where guaranteed contracts were still rare enough to be genuinely valuable, giving one up voluntarily wasn't a small gesture. It meant walking away from the locker room, the income, and the identity he'd spent years building on the basis of loyalty to a marriage rather than a calculation about his own career. Whatever else would eventually happen between them, that choice reflected exactly where his priorities stood at the time. The years that followed took the couple to Los Angeles, chasing mainstream entertainment opportunities that never fully materialized the way they'd hoped. Marc stepped away from performing entirely and worked as Rena's manager, supporting her television and modeling opportunities from behind the scenes. It was a complete reversal of the roles. They'd started with the headline act, now managing the career of the person who had once stood behind him. By around 2002, with Hollywood not offering what either of them needed, the path back to WWE, the very company they'd once denounced, became the most realistic option left. When Sable returned in 2003, it was without Marc standing beside her this time. He stayed home in Florida, taking on the role of a stay-at-home parent to their daughter, Mariah, while Sable worked the WWE's full travel schedule. It's a quiet detail, easy to skip past, but it marks a real turning point. A man who had built his entire adult identity around being watched, competed against and responded to by live crowds, was now, for the first time in his adult life, mostly at home, managing a household instead of an opponent, measuring his days by school pickups rather than arena bookings. The company Sable returned to had also changed. This was the ruthless aggression era, built around a new generation of elite athletes with real amateur pedigrees, Olympic wrestlers, decorated collegiate champions, and at the center of it stood a young performer named Brock Lesnar. Lesnar was a former NCAA Division I wrestling champion already being built into the face of the company, younger, larger, and rising in exactly the way Marc himself once had years earlier, in an entirely different locker room culture than the one Marc had left behind. What happened between Sable and Brock Lesnar during this period has never been laid out publicly in full detail by either of them, and much of what circulates online remains rumor rather than confirmed fact. Some accounts describe a gradual breakdown in communication between Marc and Rena during her time back on the road. Others frame it differently. What is well documented is the outcome. Marc and Rena's marriage ended in divorce in 2004, and not long afterward, Sable and Brock Lesnar's relationship became public. The two were married in 2006 and have largely stayed out of the spotlight since, raising a family privately, away from the wrestling world that had first brought them together. For Marc, the years immediately following the divorce were, by his own public description in later interviews, the hardest of his life. He has spoken openly about entering a serious depression during this period, losing not just his marriage, but the career and identity he'd built his entire adult life around, while facing public mockery from a wrestling world that had once celebrated him. Colleagues who had once respected the Wildman now saw a man whose story had become a punchline in a business not always known for its gentleness toward those perceived to have lost. He has since spoken candidly, in interviews and public talks, about reaching a genuine crisis point during this time. Out of respect for how seriously that subject deserves to be handled, the specifics aren't the focus here. What matters is that he sought a way back from it and found one. That path led him away from wrestling entirely. Marc underwent what he has described as a significant spiritual transformation, and in 2007 founded Champion of Choices, a non-profit focused on speaking to young people about the decisions that shape a life. He has spent years since then in schools and community centers, sharing his own story, the rise, the fall, and everything in between, as a way of reaching people going through their own version of the same collapse. Where his career once revolved around commanding a live crowd through physical performance, his second act asks something different of him, standing in front of teenagers with no script and no ring, just an honest account of what went wrong and what came after. Perhaps the most striking part of how Marc has chosen to tell this story publicly is the tone he's chosen to tell it in. Rather than framing Rena or Brock Lesnar as villains, he has spoken about both with notable restraint, at times even gratitude, describing the collapse of that chapter of his life as the thing that eventually pushed him toward work he considers more meaningful than anything he did inside a wrestling ring. Whether every viewer finds that framing fully convincing is a fair question. Public reinvention narratives often smooth over rougher edges than they show, but it's the account Marc himself has consistently given, repeated across enough interviews and enough years that it reads less like a talking point and more like a settled belief. Throughout all of it, one thing has remained constant: his relationship with his daughter, Mariah, whom he raised through the most difficult years of this story and has continued to prioritize since. Whatever else the divorce cost him, by his own account, it never cost him that. The public version of this story is often reduced to a single headline: the man who lost his wife to Brock Lesnar. But the fuller documented arc is more complicated than that framing allows. It includes a rare guaranteed contract, a real marriage restructured by sudden fame, a lawsuit that cost a career on principle, a cross-country detour into Hollywood that didn't pan out, a divorce, a genuine personal crisis, and a second act, built around turning that crisis into something usable for other people. Fame, as this story shows clearly enough, has never come with a guarantee that the relationships underneath it survive the climb. What each person did after that collapse, Sable building a quiet, private family life away from the spotlight that once made her famous. Marc rebuilding an entirely new purpose out of the wreckage of his old one, says more about who they actually are than the headline built around their divorce ever could.